Thank you.
A really fascinating documentary is screening at the Sydney Film Festival, a documentary called John Farrow, Hollywood's Man in the Shadows. Really interesting story about this filmmaker. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the directors of John Farrow, Hollywood's Man in the Shadows, Frans Vandenburg and Claude Gonzalez. Welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Such an interesting story about this Sydney-born filmmaker with such an incredible story. I gather this goes back a number of years for both of you. Tell me about the origins of making this documentary.
Frans and I met some time ago when we were working together, and we'd been making films for a while individually, and then suddenly when working together, we'd always been in a conversation about the films we loved, the films of the 40s, the studio system, the noir period. We'd both share that great love of those films. And then via a conversation we had after Frans had spoken about The Big Clock on radio, as so happens, in 2006, Frans, I believe.
That's right, yeah.
When he had spoken about The Big Clock and Farrow, we'd bumped into each other again, and suddenly we began speaking about this mysterious John Farrow. We didn't really know too much about him. We looked into film books and magazines and so forth, trying to find a little bit more about him. We both loved The Big Clock. Our conversations led us to look more and more into the fact that he didn't have any biographies, there weren't any interviews around about him, no archive. And Frans and I then discovered that he was Australian, to our astonishment. And slowly that began a love of his work and an appreciation of this mysterious man that had gone to Hollywood in the, as a boy. And Frans, do you want to take over from there? His drive to get overseas?
Sure. I mean, to pick up sort of where Claude was going, Peter, we also, in our initial investigations, realised that as John Farrow was very unknown here in Australia, and Claude and I have both had experience in teaching. He certainly wasn't mentioned at AFTRS or any of the other film establishments that we could find. And we just found, again, that was a major oversight. Farrow himself contributed to that quite a bit, I think, because he seemed to, once he was overseas, he chose the opportunity to sort of reinvent himself. And he had many, many, many different roles, of which we hopefully explore some of in the film.
Well, you certainly do that. It is, for me, it seems like such a comprehensive documentary. And what is, I mean, there's a number of aspects to this that I found intriguing, that he, as a very young boy, he sort of escaped Sydney and went to the Marine, with the Navy, or so he was involved with, and so on. So his background is so interesting and probably informed a lot of the films that he made later on.
Yes, he had a very early start. He wanted to, it seemed like he wanted to get away pretty much as soon as he could. He was able to join, legally able to join the Merchant Marine, which he did in about 1919 at the tender age of just under 16. You could do that legally then. And very soon he found himself sailing the South Pacific in somewhat of a sort of fantasy career, but he was actually doing it. And during that time, for several years, he did serve on Merchant Marines. We include photographs of him in the film. And during that time, he also began to write and certainly experienced the wonders of the South Sea. And so by the time he sort of sailed into San Francisco, which was in the very early 20s, where he jumped ship, he was well experienced in both seafaring and also writing.
And it's so interesting that he was able to move into Hollywood, and his first credits go back to 1927. I noticed writing titles, stories, etc. I can imagine Hollywood at that time was open to so many different people and so many experiences.
A lot of his experience came in quite handy because he was able to, like others, parlay his seafaring tales, seafaring adventures into stories that he could pitch to studios. He began very early with some acting experience in San Francisco and had a relationship there, had left and gone to Hollywood. He saw the opportunity to actually begin to put forward his ideas, and many of these were story pitches first, and then later on became as a title card writer, as a script writer, as a dialogue writer. By the late 20s, he'd already began, I think he had about 25 screenplays, which he would count as titles as well. And that transition into sound made a lot of opportunities for many people. Emigres, for example, we hear later of Billy Wilder and the Germans and the Europeans of the 1930s. The same thing was happening in the early 20s in Hollywood with people who were very experienced, let's say in cowboy scenarios or seafaring scenarios, being able to turn their trade into a Hollywood story. And Farrow was no different, but having that adventurous spirit, he was able to move very quickly into getting his name seen and getting his name around town.
He was there at a very fortunate time, and he did so well, so rapidly, by the looks of it. And it's so interesting to note one of the pivotal films that he directed. I think his first, although it's uncredited, I noticed, Tarzan Escapes. He obviously was involved with that. And that's, of course, where Maureen O'Sullivan comes into it.
That's right, Peter. He, as Claude said, he transitioned very quickly from the silent era. I mean, a lot of luck also is involved in John Farrow's story. The early part of his life was luck-filled. And then certainly in Hollywood, he was there at the right time. He was a man who made most of his opportunities, and he certainly looked for them. As you mentioned, he started off in 27. The late 20s, he transitioned into sound. The credit that you mentioned was an interesting one because earlier in the 30s, he'd met Maureen O'Sullivan around town. He was a very famous womanizer even at that stage. He was an attractive man. He'd already had one marriage in San Francisco, which he left in order to go to Hollywood. He had a child there as well. He was squiring many of the sort of what we would now describe as the hot actresses of the time, and they loved his company and he loved them, including one Maureen O'Sullivan, who at the time was, of course, Louis B. Mayer's favorite at MGM. They have varying stories about how they met, but let's assume they did, as they did. Through her influence, I think, Louis B. Mayer seemed to want to give her anything. John Farrow had a shot at doing a short film, and unusually for them, this was pre the Tarzan credit. It was a short film, but unusually it was shot in color. So MGM spent quite a bit of money on that film. It was called The Spectacle Maker. A copy is available to be screened, and it's a very interesting film. But nevertheless, by this stage, Maureen was the most famous and long-lived Jane in the Tarzan series. So he got a gig on this Tarzan movie that you mentioned, Tarzan Escapes. It was a very troubled production. He wasn't the first director on it, but he was sort of given a chance to take over and see what he could do with it. He did a lot of work on it, but as soon as the censors saw it, they freaked out. Hollywood was very troubled at the time with, as often they are, sex and violence. And one of John's tasks was apparently to make that film less so. Unfortunately, he made it more so. And a lot of the scenes there's a very famous scene which involves vampire bats, which I'm sure would be very intriguing now. The only materials left on that is a lot of wonderful sketches of the time. Nevertheless, he lost out on that production, and it was taken over yet again by another director and eventually finished. MGM were prepared to sink money into those films because they were certainly very popular, and they made heaps, much more of their investment back.
How interesting. And then he went on to direct around about 50 films by the looks of it. And although he finished off with a television series, and he also wrote and produced as well. So tell me about gathering all of this information, finding clips, getting access to the clips, I suppose, and especially the interviews that you were able to do with family, as well as notable people. And you've got some really great people involved, like Bertrand Tavernier and Terry Moore and Bruce Beresford and so on. Terrific process. Tell me about all of that.
Yeah, it was a sort of long journey for Frans and I. It was sort of a 10-year period. And over that time, when we decided to make the film, we began a letter writing campaign to reach out to actors, family, people who might have known about Farrow, because as we said before, it was very difficult to find information about John Farrow, the film director. There was his filmography we could find, but really there weren't a lot of critics and not a lot of written essays on his work at all. Hunting those people, we sent out various letters, and slowly, over a number of years, we received contact from various family members here in Australia as well. Overseas, obviously, we contacted the Farrow clan overseas, but also we were very lucky to meet up with two of his actors that he used, Terry Moore and Daryl Hickman. But over that period, we began to reach out to directors who knew about his work, who could tell us critically about why this person was so special, what made him such a dynamic and very forthright film director of the period. Why had he been forgotten? Why had others been heralded and made more of than he had? He made 50 films just as Hitchcock had, but he'd been more productive over that period. He'd gone through periods of 10-year periods of, let's say, making 15 films every 10 years. So you could see a very driven filmmaker, a very talented filmmaker. The more Frans and I looked at his work, we could see he was this very stylish director. Not only was he aggressively putting forward his story very early on, very much like Howard Hawks, very much on the front foot, but also would move the camera. He was a very visual and dynamic director that had not been seen before from, let's say, that period that had transitioned from the 30s, 40s, 50s into the 60s. So he had a very dynamic personality. Frans and I then went overseas. Frans, did you want to mention how we traveled overseas?
Yes, we made a number of trips overseas during this 10-year period, Peter. Once we got interested in the project, and actually it took us a little bit of time to get the money together because we didn't have any government investment. We were also doing our day jobs. So once we set off, we tried to maximize naturally our opportunities. So we wouldn't go anywhere unless we had 2 or 3 or 4, or hopefully more interviews lined up. And we sort of hit the streets running. We had very quick schedules to do these. So the first family member that really responded to us with interest was Charles Farrow, John Farrow's son. And so that was our first interview. We went across to interview him and another group of people in America. And so that was sort of our process. We collated those interviews, came back. We started to look at them and realize who we sort of would love to, we had a bucket list of people we'd really like to meet, because time was against us, not only for getting the film finished, but also all this is a very long time ago. And so a lot of people even then that had passed away since we started the film. Unfortunately, people that are so good in the film, like Jane Russell and several other actresses and actors, had all passed away. But we were lucky in getting Terry Moore and also Daryl Hickman, and also the fact that they were able to speak to us and wanted to speak to us. Terry Moore is now 90 plus and still alive and still working in film. Daryl is still working, but he's sort of pulling back on his adventures a bit. But it was a long process, and we were very lucky in whom we did get. And the directors that we eventually Claude was very helpful and organized Bertrand Tavernier very, very helpfully through his contacts, and a lot of the other Australian directors I'd worked with. So we were lucky that they were interested, and also a number of them speak quite passionately about John, particularly Philippe Moore and Philip Noyce. So we were lucky, and again, we were lucky as well as Farrow in that our contacts came through for us.
I mean, many times I think we were fortunate in the sense that we were trying to find people that knew something about Farrow, because not every critic we reached out to knew anything or had seen Farrow's films. We were lucky because we'd been collecting those films and had become interested in him, had seen how interesting he was. He was a filmmaker, but we couldn't always find an articulate voice. And so it meant really reaching out to sometimes well-known critics or well-known voices. Other times it was that other voice from a different perspective that would give the film its different spin. And you've mentioned the clips we found, and a lot of that was to do with the fact that we wanted to show Farrow at his best, because we created many themes in the film, one of them being really the father figure, the other being the filmmaker, the other the Catholic, all of these things that he was, the philanderer. And all of these milestones and characteristics in his life were best seen in his films. And a majority of our work and the investment of our funds went into archive, because that's where we could show him flourishing as a filmmaker. Frans was very lucky once and came across some audio of Farrow, which we included in the film. And it's really the only snippet of him participating in dialogue, and it's from the Big Clocks radio program. And in that we can hear Farrow's voice, because as I said, there is no audio aside from that and a few other snippets that we were able to include in the film.
Just a quick one about Mia Farrow. Did she respond at all?
She did. We wrote to all the family members. We wrote to Prudence and Mia, and we invited all of them, but for some reason, they always stepped back. I mean, Mia responded saying that she had written about her father in her book and didn't want to participate, but she was able to extend an invitation to allow us to use her audio and use her photos, as many of the other family members did as well here and overseas. And those opportunities came up, but the family, maybe because of all they had gone through, or the tragedy, or the publicity they had gone through over the years, was much shyer in participating in a new phase of the Farrow name. So unfortunately, we weren't able to enlist her help further than that. But as Frans has mentioned, John Charles Farrow was able to take part. And we found that he created a very strong dynamic in the film too, about the father's relationship. And he's also very good about the father being a director, because he was directed in John Paul Jones by John Farrow.
Right. How interesting. It's so interesting to note the contradictions in John Farrow's life, the very much a family man and yet was a philanderer, the conversion to Catholicism and yet not necessarily upholding all the Catholic tenets, even though he wrote about Catholicism in a book. I find that so interesting in itself, and so difficult to resolve, which in a way makes him quite an enigmatic sort of person, I suppose.
That's terrific you've put it like that, Peter, because one of the things we really wanted to illustrate was those very contradictions. It's always piqued our interest and kept us going. I mean, a lot of films hope to tell you everything you need to know about people, and biographies the same. We knew that we couldn't do this with Farrow because he'd seemed to have spent quite a bit of time just living his life and being elusive and being contradictory. There's a wonderful story, just to give you an example of his contradiction, particularly with the Catholicism. Aside from his reported philandering and stuff, there's a wonderful interview with Robert Mitchum, where Mitchum talks about Farrow. They did a number of films together and became quite good friends. I think they both had very low, they didn't suffer fools, lightly. And so both got on very well. And both liked to drink. And Mitchum particularly found Farrow extraordinary, that Mitchum felt he was pretty much, the best drinker in the world, and he found that Farrow could match him. That seemed to egg them on in their friendship. And one of the stories is that he's at one point Robert Mitchum said to Farrow, "I can't believe that you proposed to be this Catholic that you are, considering the lifestyle you lead." And Farrow apparently looked at him with a straight face and said, "But I go to confession once a week and confess my sins, and that's terrific." And Mitchum still didn't believe this, and he said, "Well, how can you get away with this every week?" And Farrow went on to describe that he went to this particular church in Los Angeles and did this once a week and was never to miss. It turned out, he then went on to tell Mitchum that the priest was Spanish and couldn't understand English. And so Mitchum thought that was a terrific story and sort of illustrated this elusiveness and somewhat, scallywag or nasty or whatever you want to call it side of Farrow, that he was always conniving something and getting up to mischief somewhere.
How fascinating. And then there's also this murder mystery that he was involved with, which is quite intriguing.
Well, it's sort of, he was on the surrounds of that, like a lot of other things. He's not in any way implicated in it, but because he was a player at that time, and because the whole murder scene is such a part of Hollywood law, the Black Dahlia and everything else, he certainly was in that circle that were interested in surrealism and living large and parties. And, he was there. He definitely was there. And being a film director, a lot of another of his peers, John Huston, was also part of that same circle. So they were all in and out of each other's pockets.
He's for such a straight-laced, above Catholic life. He had this undercurrent that he would leave at night from the family home. He would have affairs. He had a second family. With Frans and I found that there are 4 other children outside of the marriage. His marriage to Maureen O'Sullivan produced 7 children, but then having another family, another set of children outside of that, those contradictions kept coming up and made him a fascinating figure. But he didn't embrace publicity. There are very few articles in magazines about him. He seems to sort of like this sort of quieter, publicity shy side, even though he's a very dynamic alpha male type, a man who published 8 books in his lifetime. In those 58 years, made 50 films. In that time, acted at least 4 or 5 times in other films or his own. So he had this sort of very driven, very burning candle at both ends personality.
Again, very interesting. And of course, he was responsible for a number of really impressive films, and I suppose his background imbued into those films that sort of those contradictions and so on. And you mentioned The Big Clock, which of course is a great film, and His Kind of Woman, which I remember, and The Night Has a Thousand Eyes, which was a very impressive film. So he really has an interesting filmography. But I'm also intrigued about his Australian background, and he used that, I suppose, for the film Botany Bay. And I'm wondering how much of his Australian heritage was part of his Hollywood experience.
I think it's interesting you say that too, Peter, because he never came back to Australia physically, and Botany Bay was going to be a very different film. It kicked around Paramount for a very long time. Eventually, it ended up with him. So I don't think he was the first director in mind. He used, he obviously thought back on it and was going to enjoy the prospect of doing it. There's other involved stories, but I'll try and mention one of them. He contacted a relative in Australia to elicit that relative's help getting koalas and kangaroos sent across from Sydney, the Sydney Zoo, which was unheard of at the time, to be used in the filming. And they do the two koalas and a couple of the kangaroos didn't actually make the scenes, but the two koalas feature quite importantly at the end of the film. Unfortunately, I don't think the film is considered one of his best. And yet again, this is a contradiction because it involves themes. He would certainly know Botany Bay very well. Unfortunately, he ran into money, and we've found details that he was going to come back here, or the studio at Paramount was going to send him back here to shoot it here, which would have been caused a much better film. In the end, it starred Alan Ladd, who he got on with very well. They made a number of films together at Paramount. But Alan, unfortunately, again, through this time bad luck, he was ending his contract with Paramount, and so they decided they weren't going to spend that much money on it. So the scenes ended up being shot mainly in the studios in Hollywood, and so the bush settings somewhat aren't quite up to scratch as you'd expect, and I think they used some Afro-Americans as the local Aborigines. So it all descended into a bit of chaos. Except the koalas did a very good job, and not James Mason.
It is James Mason.
James Mason and Patricia Medina are very good in the film, as is Alan Ladd. So it's a mix up with him again. It should have been a much better film. He should have been able to rely upon his Australianness, but unfortunately it let him down. And so again, it's ironic that I think some of his best films are ones set totally in the American film noir genre.
Yes. I fully agree with you. And we should praise him too. I mean, he did receive an Oscar nomination as a director for Wake Island, and he won an Oscar with his co-writers for Around the World in 80 Days in 56. So he obviously was reasonably well liked in the Hollywood community.
Well, he's a very efficient director. I mean, that's what we point out too, that being part of the studio system where it's really a factory and very difficult to imbue anything with a personal touch, Farrow he was able to create a very stylistic approach to filmmaking, very visually arresting. And I think when you look at his films, you see a man that could actually transcend genres. He made musicals, he made comedies, he made war films, and right through to noir and right through to television. So he is a very adept at changing styles and changing and adapting. But I think right through a lot of his work, you see this sense of not only the mystical sometimes that we point out in the film, that he's searching, that he has a sense of God and the idea of something darker. And we point that out with one of two of his films, that he had a sense of fairness. When you look at the case of Hondo, his Western with John Wayne, a 3D film, his sense of right and wrong and his sense of principles come out quite strongly. So he has a current that he's able to put in as an auteur, maybe not. It's a very difficult case to make for Farrow because he was a very commercial director, but you can see concerns that he comes back to again and again. And he was very, let's say, a person that could just see round the corner too, in the sense that he could see that Hollywood was becoming more and more a medium of a producer. So later on, towards the end of the 40s and into the 50s, he became a producer director. And then towards the end, he became a producer director that stepped into television like Hitchcock had. So he had an eye for what was to come and a writer's sensibility of a good story.
He certainly did, and as you say, he ended his career with Empire, a TV series that he was responsible for 3 episodes. So very much like Hitchcock, as you say, quite rightly. So in a way, it was sad that he died considerably younger, I suppose, than would normally happen. And I suppose his life was pretty tumultuous.
Dying as young as he did, Peter, really not only was a tragedy for him and his family, it was unexpected. He was as a younger man, he was very fit and he was a great swimmer. I mentioned that he did drink. We can't ever find out if he smoked. I doubt that he did, but he certainly liked to drink, but he was very fit. But he had a number of tragedies in his later life. The major one being the loss of his eldest son in a ridiculously crazy plane crash above Los Angeles in a clear sky. Two light planes collided with each other. And unfortunately, it was during the shoot of his last film, he and the rest of the family are on location in Spain. This is 1959, and the film was John Paul Jones, another seafaring film and one that he did very well at. This really set the cat among the pigeons for him. He never really recovered from that. And I think spent the last, from 59, he died, in 63. He was almost a broken man. I think also things that were going on for him was that Maureen, who had been very, let's say, accommodating to these affairs and things, she was starting to get a bit tired of this. The kids were growing up, they were becoming teenagers, so life was getting difficult. He also, as Claude mentioned, he was now producing as well as directing, and so money at that time, late 50s, was becoming harder to get. The studio system had changed, so people were looking around for money, and films were still big budgeted then. There was no, despite the fact that they had lost the studio system, they still required films to be made like that, with 35 mil expensive lighting and big crews. And unlike now, where we can make a film on a phone, they still had to do the conventional filmmaking. So dying at 58 in 1963 really helped, if you like, disguise him. He never became known to the enfant terribles, or the brat pack of film writers who were coming in, like Bogdanovich and people like that, who were already beginning to start doing interviews with famous people of his peer group, John Ford, Howard Hawks. So he missed out on that discovery, and that led to him being undiscovered for so many years, despite the fact that he'd made 50 films. And so all these factors, including his own reticence at making a big fuss about himself, which one could also consider to be one of his few Australian traits, the sort of, I'm not going to, put myself out there. And also the fact that he never seemed to really, on his plaque, it just reads, it's a very simple plaque in the cemetery, which says, sailor poet, loved husband and father. It doesn't say filmmaker. He tended to think of himself as a poet and a writer first. He obviously was good at making films, which he did. And one of the other things that put him into the obscure camp, I think, was the fact, as Claude mentioned, that he was able to go from genre to genre to genre. Unlike filmmakers now, he never had a history of going to a film school. He never made independent films and gradually made his work up. He hit the ground running, and he only worked for the major studios, which is incredible considering his, let's say, lack of experience. He worked for every major studio, Paramount, Warner Brothers, MGM.
I think it's also interesting, Frans, too, that we found a person that was a doer. I mean, that generation of men and women that came from, let's say, the 20s and then the 30s and the war years were all doers. They would do rather than talk themselves up. These had individuals that would work very hard to get ahead and had a lot to prove to their generation as well. So it's very generationally different from the filmmakers that came later on. He is a pioneer for us because he was there as an Australian before the 70s generation that we herald rightly, and we take great pride in as an Australian filmmaking set. But that generation of the Errol Flynns, the Judith Andersons, the John Farrows were a very different breed. They went out on basically, as Farrow did, a ship and conquered the world before them in very different ways.
How interesting. It's what a terrific documentary, and such an important filmmaker, John Farrow, hence the title, Hollywood's Man in the Shadows. I'm so glad to see the film is rolling out. I mean, I noticed it had already been shown overseas at Il Cinema Ritrovato in Italy, and won an award at the Madrid Film Festival, which is fantastic. And now it's screening at the next month at the Sydney Film Festival, and then hopefully it will be rolled out in cinemas after that, I suppose.
That's good. Yes, that's true. And we're trying very hard to get the name of John Farrow out there, because it is a missing piece, almost a missing link in not only Australian cinema history, but that Hollywood studio system. And many others have mentioned his name in the last 5 or so years. But it's funny, when Frans and I began, we were the only two people worried about who John Farrow was, and here we are at the back end.
And during that time, a lot of his films have fortunately become more available for the home market, and they're falling more and more into that classic collector's editions, Blu-rays with commentaries. People are beginning to notice them. I mean, I was thinking of you particularly, Peter, with one of the films we managed to find. How we did, I don't know, but The Hitler Gang. I was thinking of you, your German film interest.
Yep.
I mean, that's still not officially available, but it will be, like so many of his other films, hopefully. And our film will get help towards that.
Absolutely, it will. And I'm sure the National Film and Sound Archive would be very interested in your documentary as well, because it's so important that we recognise our Australian filmmakers. Look, Claude and Frans, thank you so much for talking with me about John Farrow, Hollywood's Man in the Shadows, a documentary that I urge everyone to see. Thanks so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.